I remember I flew over and I met some people on the airplane and I put a couple jobs together, sort of on the airplane. So I did a bunch of apartments.
Coming to Hawaii?
Yeah, I did apartments in Mokule'i and I did some renovations in Waikiki.
This is on the way here during a college break?
Yeah.
Because you had to pay for
By the
yourself.
time I landed, I had put together 3 projects that, I did in a week or so, and then I had spare time and a little extra money. So I kind of had a knack for doing this kind of stuff.
This ability to create jobs for himself on the fly got him through college, and he continues to amaze with a large business that welcomes international clients with very difficult problems and works to solve them. Patrick Sullivan, next on Long Story Short.
One-on-one engaging conversations with some of Hawaii's most intriguing people. Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox.
Aloha mai kako, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Patrick Kevin Sullivan is the founder and chairman of Oceanit, a Honolulu-based company that has raised more than $475 million in research and development funds since it was founded in 1985. A staff of about 160 scientists and engineers combines their skills in a mind-to-matter process to create solutions to some of the world's most difficult problems. Sullivan's path as a fearless innovator started when he was young, wanting to pursue higher education and knowing that he would need money for that. By the time he entered college, he was already comfortable with bidding jobs and hiring workers.
My parents didn't have education, and there were 5 kids, so it was all about feeding the kids, and that was pretty much it. My dad worked, my mom didn't. And
what did he do?
Well, he started out doing aircraft maintenance kind of stuff in Los Angeles, and then he started doing some kind of landscaping work. And then we moved up north to Seattle, and when the very first 747, so he got recruited to work there as a mechanic. And I remember going through the mock-up on plywood. It was really interesting, because the whole aircraft was made of plywood at that time. And so the whole family moved, which I thought was a big traumatic thing. It turned out it was a really good thing, but I thought, well, if everything in the world is right here in LA, and then we move, and I thought, well, there's nothing here, but it turns out there's a lot there. So I learned a lot from that kind of an experience. But then Boeing went through a down cycle, and it was just devastating. So everybody was out of work, and everybody got laid off. So living through those kinds of things, right? So that's what led him to, okay, there's no more work, so we're going to move, and that's kind of what.
And where did you move to?
So we went from there, I think we went to Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, Texas. So,
and you were switching schools as you went?
Yeah. So I went to 4 different high schools, which is brings its own challenges. Right, because
you're the new kid in the room.
Yeah, so the first thing is within the first 30, 60 days, you're going to get in a fight. Just get over it, right? Do it sooner than later, but every school is like that. So you go through these things and you learn a lot, and so that's why we moved around so much. I mean, they tried to keep everything together, but it was just really hard. And I think from my perspective, that's why education was so important.
Well, you were living paycheck to paycheck or job to job. Did you ever go hungry? Did you ever not be able to pay your rent?
Well, so they struggled with that stuff, and we used to buy, my parents used to buy food in bulk. So like half a cow, right? So you carve it up, or powdered milk by the box, right? So it wasn't regular milk, but it was powdered milk. So you always had something, and of course, lots of potatoes.
Do you eat many of them now?
My wife really likes potatoes. I still do, but not, but they kind of made do. And then when I started, when I was about 17, I started living on my own. And then there were...
So you left the house and were not supported by them at all? Didn't live in the home?
Yeah, I bought a car. So I started working when I was 13, and I saved up all my checks. And then I just went out and bought a car when I turned 16. And the funny thing is, I didn't have a driver's license or anything, but I brought all the paychecks, I got the cash, I just went in and bought a car. And then I drove the car to the driver's license thing because I needed a driver's license. But otherwise, what are you going to do, right? And then when I started, living on my own, that was it. Right? I had the car, so my friends in college called it the Dodge Hilton. So
You slept in your car at times?
Yeah, a lot, and because it was out of the rain and out of the snow, and it would sometimes get cold. But when I think about it, I was mobile and I could do all kinds of things, so I wasn't feeling sorry for myself.
What did you have a discussion with your parents before you took off?
Well, I wanted to go to college, and so I drove to college, and that was it, right? So, and I was able to get into the dorm. This was in Boulder.
How did you manage that since you came virtually without money?
So I did some loans, and I was, the only thing I could do was math, but I got into engineering, and I applied to a couple schools. I got into a couple schools. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it turned out that was a good idea. So it was School of Mines, which is for mining engineering, which is the best school in the country for that, and then University of Colorado. And then at the time, I remember I thought the girls were much nicer in Boulder, and of course that's where I met my wife. But so that was probably a good move. But student loans, grants, a work study. So I worked through all semesters in the labs. So I spent a lot of time in labs, and then I started a business when I was probably 17, doing because I started doing a lot of manual labor when I was probably 15, 14. Originally at 13, I was working in restaurants, right? So I did everything from busboy, bellhop, dishwasher, did all that kind of stuff. So I was earning some money. And before that, I was actually cutting yards. So me and this guy, E.J. Babbitt, would compete for houses and we'd get like $1, $2 a house, right, to go cut the grass and do all the trimming.
You did the sales and the work.
Right. So we'd compete on doing these in the neighborhood. But I kind of learned by the 17, 18 that I could earn money in the summer by bidding on jobs. So I started doing landscaping and irrigation. So I learned irrigation from working, right? So I started out, what happens is I could dig a really good ditch straight, right? And they said, okay, we're going to show you how to lay pipe, right? And then we're going to show you how to do joints. And then we're going to show you, because everything I did, I tried to do a good job. And so slowly they would give me, like, can you do this? And so I learned everything from actually just doing the work. So by the time I was maybe 18, 17, 18, right in there, I was able to kind of bid jobs, and then I would put and do the install. So I did, Denny's, Sambo's, we did Motel 6, commercial office buildings, these little chicken places, and I would just knock on the door during construction, talk to the guy running the job and say, you have anybody to do this? And give him a price. And then I started it basically on a credit card because I didn't have any money. But I would, I would do that to earn money to stay in college, right? So that's how I would help pay for college too. So loans, grants, work study, and doing these projects. And
did you hire people, or did you do all that landscaping
No,
yourself?
I would hire, and so it turns out I ended up with a Hawaiian crew. There are a lot of Hawaiians in Boulder. And they were in engineering, right? So I knew a lot of guys. And so I said, look, you want to earn some extra money? Why don't you show up? And so I would put these guys to work, and it would just be physical labor, but they're young guys. And
pay them in cash?
Yeah. Or sometimes I would hire, you can go to like these employment service things where you got guys standing around that just need a job. And some places there's like corners where people that need work just hang out. And you go by and you say, okay, can I get this guy and this guy? And you put them on the job. And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're, one of the problems with those guys in general, and it's an oversimplification, but they get paid and then they go get drugs. Or they get paid and then they get alcohol. So some of them are having issues. So I had guys like that too. But I would do that in Colorado, Arizona, and parts of Wyoming. So one of the first big jobs I did was it's a big restaurant in Cheyenne. And I put the high school football team to work, literally. So I also worked in between jobs as a roustabout, so in the oil field. So I worked at the time in parts of Wyoming. So of course, there wasn't much going on in Cheyenne, but Rock Springs was considered at the time the last boomtown of the West. It was like something out of an old West. Casper, Rollins. So I was in a place, an abandoned house with a bunch of guys across from the Rollins prison, and I put in a shower. I said, I can't stand this, right? So I put in my own plumbing to make a shower. But you can make a lot of money working in the oil patch, right? But it's just hard, dirty work. And so we were building the infrastructure. This is in the summer. So, and I needed to make money.
How much time did this leave you for school?
I always studied. I enjoyed what I did in school. So the goal was to make money to be in school. That was always the goal.
And how did you manage that? How did you balance it?
It's work, right? You just do it. And so I never really worried about that, but yeah, it does kind of add a bunch of other things complicates things. But in my view, school was the single most important thing. And so I just focused on that. But I was able to, by the time I graduated, I actually had put together a lot of money. Because I remember when I got married, I thought I needed to buy a house. So I had saved up a bunch of money.
While you were in college,
while I was
paying
in college.
For tuition on your own.
Yeah, and I thought, okay, I need to have money to buy a house if I'm going to get married. And then I went to grad school and I thought, okay, I didn't know much about buying a house, but I did it. I was probably, 22, 23, right? And so I learned a lot. I learned how not to do it. And later on how to do it. But I always kind of had a knack to make money. I never saw it as an endpoint, as a way to be able to do the things that were important. But I needed to make money because when you don't have any money and I remember trying to qualify, I couldn't get food stamps because if you're in college, you can't get food stamps. So I'd buy like big cartons of eggs and loaves of bread and box of oranges, right, and live on that for a while, because that's it, right? I mean, and you could buy subprime oranges. They don't have to be like the top line oranges, and you can get them in Albertsons. Go talk to the produce guys in the back and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what I did to make sure I had food. Not all the time, but there were times, right? So that got me focusing on, okay, I better earn some money. So the work study was good. The grants were good. I paid off. It was called there was Basic Educational Opportunity Grant. There was the thing called it was Defense Student Loan or something like that. And so when I graduated, I had some debt, so I was able to pay that off too. But it was never a question that I wasn't going to be able to do it. It was just trying to balance all these different things.
That must have been an enormous burden for a 17-year-old, 18. I mean, you were juggling so much. I mean, sleep must not have been a priority at that point.
I probably didn't sleep a whole lot. Yeah, I think.
When you look back, it was probably harder than you knew at the time.
Well, for a lot of these things, if you know how hard it's going to be before you do it, you probably wouldn't. So I better not think about it and just, kind of focus on what's the right thing to do. And no, I don't feel bad about it or regret it, but I learned a lot in the process, because it's not just the education for the sake of education, but for the sake of learning.
Entrepreneur Patrick Sullivan was always good at math and decided early on that he wanted to be an engineer. Beyond that, he didn't have a plan.
When I started in Boulder, I wanted to do aerospace, and they were laying off aerospace engineers. So I ended up pivoting into engineering physics, which was a good move for me at the time. But you would think, well, that's crazy. So Boulder, would educate most of the astronauts. they'd all go through Boulder. So you could see that if you went through aerospace in Boulder, maybe you could be an astronaut. But then that whole thing kind of went down. So industries go up and down, but a good education is much more durable. And so I thought engineering physics is good, because it's very broad, it's applied, hands-on. A big emphasis in nuclear, so I thought at the time, I should do nuclear engineering. And then I worked in an atomic and nuclear lab for a year, during the school year. And I thought, maybe I need to get outside more, because we had a cyclotron, which would produce these particles. And that was really interesting. And I spent all my time going through the data, that kind of stuff. But I think it was a good experience, because I thought, okay, maybe I don't want to do this quite like this. And there was another thing I remember. I walked by and picked up a sample of something that was radioactive. And when you work with this stuff, you think, no big deal. I picked it up and I walked by a Geiger counter and the thing goes off, and I thought, Jesus, you get really comfortable, and that's kind of dangerous, right? So I thought, okay, I need to think. So I didn't stay in the nuclear track, although did lots of atomic and nuclear stuff, which is good. It's a good intellectual exercise.
Yeah, because all the way along it sounds like you were looking and seeing where things were going and retracking yourself.
Yeah.
You mentioned meeting folks from Hawaii at Boulder. Was one of them your wife?
Yeah, I did. So Jan was finishing up, and I kind of met her here through a friend of mine, Mike Ako. He introduced me, but then she was going back, and I was just finishing. I had a semester to graduate. And so she went back early, and I let her drive my car, which was, people thought, wow, you must really like her. She didn't have a car, but it was funny because the car, I had built it from junkyard parts, right? So everything kind of got bad, so I rebuilt everything, went to the junkyard, bought all the parts, put it together. And the dipstick for the oil pan was, there was a dipstick, but the real one was a calibrated coat hanger, because all the parts didn't match, but I made it work. And so she didn't know about the coat hanger, so she went in and they kept pouring oil in this engine and said, there's something wrong here. So then they had to put it up on blocks, drain it all, and do all these things. But later, she realized, I told her, yeah, it's the coat hanger on the side that would calibrate it.
And she fell in love, right?
Yes, she's amazing.
And you didn't have a true home state to return to, because you moved around a lot, but she's a person of Hawaii.
Right, and so in the beginning, so when I finished up, I got a job at Storage Tech, which was really a spin out of University of Colorado, and created that whole tech corridor. So I would go to work in the College of Engineering wing, actually, because there was no infrastructure. There were just kind of farms and stuff. So I started doing that, and I was going to go to grad school, and I started applying. But then I thought we might stay in Colorado, but then I realized that that's not how it works. and it's a wonderful thing. But yeah, so she said, we can live anywhere, but it just make sure it's in Hawaii. So
Got it.
So Patrick Sullivan moved to Hawaii and earned a PhD in engineering from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Time for a new plan.
At that time that you were going through the PhD program, did you know what you'd be doing with it?
Well, so that's a good question. Everybody said, do you want to be a professor? And I said, not really. It's too slow. And it looks, I said, nothing personal, but for a lot of this stuff, it's just not moving fast enough. And they said, well, then why are you doing this? And I said, well, education. I'm trying to learn. And to this day, that's exactly right. And my goal was to do things. And
but you didn't have a specific purpose. You wanted to apply what you knew?
Yeah, I was interested in all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And so when I finished, the option was I could be at the, find a university level type of thing, which is good in a lot of ways. But again, for me, it wasn't fast enough. And there's the shipyard, which is some really good people doing important work, but I didn't want to do that. So I created Oceanit. But I kind of knew how to do that. So I didn't feel like, I thought, yeah, okay, I can do this.
You knew how to start you mean you knew how to start a company?
Right.
Because you
Because
formed
I
companies.
learned a lot doing these kinds of projects and jobs when I was in college. And how to bid a job, how to run a crew, how to deliver stuff, how to execute. That wasn't really a big deal. That always kind of came naturally. So the thing that was important for me was I was very interested in learning the science and the applied science and engineering of stuff, because for me, that was really fun. And it was something that would allow me to build, do things, right? Make things, which is really what I wanted to do.
And sky's the limit, right?
The sky's the limit.
Or beyond the sky.
Right. So it's not limited by subject or field, it's really limited by imagination. And that really became Oceanit.
Which means?
Well, it's a Greek and Latin derivative of ocean dweller. But see, the thing about the ocean is a teacher in so many ways. But when you do work in the ocean, it's very interdisciplinary. So it covers everything from physics, chemistry, biology, hydromechanics. So it's probably the biggest mashup of all science is the ocean. So for me, it was kind of like an applied physics PhD focused on fluids. And then I did applied electrochemistry and a bunch of other things in materials, but it was a mashup. And it turns out that mashup of fields and technologies is where it's what we do today at Oceanit, right? So it's in energy and aerospace and materials and all kinds of things. But if I think about it, that is kind of what it takes to build in and around the ocean. So it worked out.
Not everybody who moves to Hawaii wants to stay. Clearly, you do and you have. What was it like for you being the Malihini in Hawaii, introduced to all kinds of new people? And
Well, I had a classmate, Eric Yee, who became a physician here. He's a Hawaiian Chinese. And I used to go surfing with his brothers. They had a big house in Nu'uanu. And that was, I think, the first time we had done this road trip, right, in the Dodge Hilton. So I brought Eric.
in your old car.
In my old car. We drove down to the Keys, we did all this stuff, and Eric hadn't been through the South, and we had this other guy from New York, and so it was a really interesting trip where we would dive in on the Keys and Eric was amazing. We're grabbing lobster and we're just cooking a fire and doing all these things. But when I would stay with him and his brothers, the Yee brothers, and we'd go surfing, and so it was kind of interesting because we'd go out surfing. Of course, they were all much better than me, and I was not that good. I've gotten better, but they would say, "Okay, ditch the haole, right? He's going to be the bait for the shark," and they go out there, and I'm going, "What?" But I learned a lot from them. They were super, super nice people, and I think.
That doesn't sound so nice.
No, they were just so nice, I thought. But it really touched me that in the community, they're so giving and so supportive. That was before I met my wife.
You came to Hawaii for love, and now and you started this business here. Is it obviously you are reaching far beyond here, but would it be easier to be somewhere else from a business standpoint?
Well, that's a good question. We just had this group here this week from Korea because they want a license for the country of Korea. We're going to do, I think, a pipeline in Turkmenistan this quarter. We're actually going to do heat exchangers in Abu Dhabi. We're starting to do, this stuff is all just kind of cranking. And it was all invented here and developed in the lab, but the market is the rest of the world. And that's how we view it. So for manufacturing and certain things, you can build facilities in different places. For the magic, this is the place.
One example of an innovative product Oceanit developed is the Life Bed, which has sensors to take vital signs without intrusive wires and electrodes or removing clothes. It started out as a request from the Department of Defense to improve triage on the battlefield. Since then, it's been adapted for hospitals, long-term care facilities, and home care because it can monitor vital signs without touching the patient. Thanks to Patrick Sullivan of Kailua, Oahu for sharing his life stories with us, and mahalo to you for joining us. For PBS Hawaii and Long Story Short, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Aloha nui.
You've trademarked, I believe, something called intellectual anarchy.
It always starts with asking a basic question, a fundamental question. Not necessarily a question that's about a science thing, but maybe a life thing, but basic questions. So getting the right question is a really big deal. When you ask the right question, then you go on this sort of a journey in exploring an answer. And that leads to a lot of interesting things.
For audio and written transcripts of all episodes of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, visit pbshawaii.org. To download free podcasts of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, go to the Apple iTunes Store or visit pbshawaii.org.